Here at the Norfolk Library. We also welcome our friends watching from home on Zoom. Good to see you, and thank you for tuning in. And if you'd like to download a copy of the program, you can go to norfolkfoundation.net and click on the link on the orange banner at the top of the homepage. Thank you for following our COVID protocols. We do want to be safe. And I just want to point out, this is the first literary event in the great room, great hall here, since in over a year and a half, I think. So welcome. I would just like to say that tomorrow we do have room here. If you have not registered for any of the events tomorrow, we do still have some openings. So please go home and sign up. We'd love to see you again tomorrow. And we will also be selling books after this event and all events. So right around the corner, the library associates will be selling books, and then Robert will be signing in the front hall. So we just want to remind you to be aware of spacing and everything as you line up to buy books and have your book signed by Robert. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Habermeyer, who is the director of the Norfolk Library.
First time I've had to take off a mask to speak at this podium. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brendan Gill Lecture, named in honor of the writer Brendan Gill, who was a beloved friend of the Norfolk Library. It is my great honor to introduce Robert Jones, Jr., author of the novel, The Prophets. Mr. Jones is a resident of New York City. He received his BFA in creative writing and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, and the Paris Review. He is the creator and curator of the social justice, social media community Son of Baldwin. The Prophets is Mr. Jones' debut novel. It was longlisted for the 2021 Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, shortlisted for the Crooks Corner Book Prize, awarded annually for the best debut novel set in the American South, and longlisted for the National Book Award for Fiction. Beautifully written, portraying the enormous power of love and hope amid devastating circumstances, this is a multi-layered novel that sits with you for a long time after you have finished reading it. In fact, when I finished reading it, I decided to listen to it and immerse myself totally, absolutely brilliant narration by Karen Chilton. The New York Review of Books said the novel might cast a spell, and it certainly did on me. I have been so looking forward to hearing the author speak this evening. Please extend a warm welcome to Robert Jones, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, closer. My mic? Okay.
I have a long list of things to do.
Okay. Should hear me now. Better. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I was always afraid that, I would have an event like this and there'd be like 3 people in the audience. I would still, speak and read, but it's nice that all of you have come out. Thank you so very much. Thank you to the staff at the library. This is such a beautiful library, and you live in such a beautiful town. My husband and I drove up earlier today. We got here about 3 o'clock, and I was just looking at the homes. They're just so gorgeous, and it's so quiet. And that's so rare in New York City. So I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I thought I would begin this lecture with reading an excerpt from The Prophets. And to do so, let me give you a little background. I'm going to be reading from the chapter of Amos. And Amos is one of the primary antagonists in the book, someone who is trying to curry favor with the master of the plantation by forcing the protagonists, Samuel and Isaiah, to do the master's bidding. And he makes a discovery about the nature of Samuel and Isaiah's relationship that disturbs him greatly. And that is where we are beginning. Let me put my reading glasses on. I'm not as young as I once was. The barn was dark. Inside, there were nothing but horses and two twisted shadows on the ground. Two shadows twisted together on the ground. Yes, Amos had seen strange things, but this beat all. He was astonished by how obvious it was, by how easily it could be missed by those who weren't curious enough to seek the answer right in front of them, because the answer, even when revealed, remained unbelievable. He had thought their kinship merely hazardous at first, never thinking it wise for any two people to be so close, not here anyway. Even with Essie, his embrace was one arm only. The other arm had to be free to cry into the crook of when the warmth of other bodies turned cold. It hadn't occurred to him until the veil was lifted and the world was clearer to him what Samuel and Isaiah's peculiar closeness meant. In the absence of women, he understood the necessity of turning to a hand or a hog, or in a last-ditch effort, begrudgingly and with falsehoods intact, the uncleanliness of other men. Hot was hot, and release for a man was always imminent, excepting unto death. But to not have a desire for women to begin with, to produce no physical response to them whatsoever, above all, to willingly choose a male to cradle you gently into sleep, even when women were as soft and abundant as cotton. Amos shook his head to clear the image from his mind. Man on top of woman, that wasn't just Christ-like, it was sensible, right? He asked the question, but rhetorically, because he was apprehensive and uncertain about an answer. There was no suitable name for whatever it was that Samuel and Isaiah were doing, at least none that he could remember. That he couldn't remember bothered him as much as the act itself. They weren't women. Women were weak, and by God's design. Nevertheless, by carrying on as though at least one of them was female, they threatened to only further diminish what Amos imagined was already diminished to death. For Samuel and Isaiah to wear their sex this way, dewy, firm, trembling, free, even under the cloak of night, was folly. If they had cared at all for any of the others, they would have, at the very least, masked their strangeness, hushed it better, goddammit, so that Tubab wouldn't discover it. Didn't they understand that here, under Paul's word, they were nobodies? Hold on. They were bodies. They were in bodies. They just had no authority over theirs. Amos could look at the embracing shadows no more, especially the one he carried from the wagon all those years ago. Can you even imagine that? Someone throwing a child into a wagon as simply as you would a sack of cotton? A child screaming and his parents being beat into the ground for daring to protest. He was impressed, though, that the boy survived the trip. A little woozy at the end of it, of course, what with the way food and water were rationed and how the insects bit. But Amos ignored his heavy shackles to catch the boy before he passed out in the dirt. Holding him, he wondered what it might be like to have a child of his own, to hold him close to his chest, that the baby might be tickled by the coils of his father's hair. And looking down at sun Son would look up at father, smile, and tug the strands of his beard so that they would both be glad. He began walking back to his cabin, avoiding the lantern light of the patrollers in the distance. He traced his steps, recalling that he had seen Samuel and Isaiah often since they were boys, mostly near the barn and, therefore, mostly segregated from the others. One black, the other purple, one smiling, the other brooding. Maybe if someone had carried him, weak-kneed, off of a wagon, Samuel might be a son too. You knew? Amos asked folk. He paid close attention to their whispers. The women were thankful for the reprieve, the others grateful for their courage. Maggie said it was something old from the other time before the ships and guns came. Amos knew of no such thing. He didn't even have to ask Essie because her and Isaiah's shared laughter now made sense. But there wasn't anything funny. He didn't understand how she didn't connect Isaiah's failure to Paul's. Paul. Amos knew that once Paul discovered that the nature of Isaiah and Samuel's stubbornness was something other than bad aim, they would inspire a passion in him that would become uncontainable. At some point, Paul's restless mind wouldn't be content with just the two of them. He would seek to inspect the others, to find increasingly creative and heartbreaking methods of preventing Samuel and Isaiah's unholiness from spreading. Because of those two, suffering would prosper. Amos felt spite growing in the midpoint of his ribs, even though it was well known that Samuel and Isaiah inspired everything around them to dance. Some old folk, the children, flies, the tips of tall grass, everything except the black-eyed Susans, which turned their heads up at whomever. Skeptical by nature, they swayed a little when the boys walked past, but never any more than that. They were secure enough in the golden of their petals that they didn't have to worship anything else except maybe the rain. Shout when she came down. Amos wished his people could be more like that. When he himself saw them together, now that he saw them, frolicking in the marsh, hefting bales of hay, and tending to the animals, or just sitting silently side by side with their backs against the barn, feeding each other with bare hands, feet too close together, he merely glorified their names. He covered his eyes because Isaiah and Samuel were bright and coated in a shining the likes of which he had never seen. A shame that he would have to be the one to smash it. It was necessary, then, that the nature of his sermons change. If the entire plantation could unite in this purpose, not just him, maybe, with a chest full of regret and with his softest voice, away from the circle of trees so that no two bob might hear and unleash chaos before it had the chance to be thwarted. Sometimes in the confines of his shack, he chastised any person who accepted, condoned, or ignored Samuel and Isaiah's behavior. Most people were frightened by this sudden shift because they weren't accustomed to his river water voice sounding so dropped. You think God don't see? He would say quietly as he pointed in the direction of the barn, his dark fingers hanging in the air, quivering like tree branches shed of leaves, hoping uncertainty wasn't wearing him like Sunday clothing. For it had been he who Paul trusted with the words of the book, and in there it had simply said, multiply and give God his glory, glory. This is what he tried to explain above the tumult of whys that had bombarded him from the lips of almost everyone he whispered to. He had anticipated difficulty, resistance, since his own legs were unsure. Samuel and Isaiah were, after all, boys, oftentimes helpful ones, who were one bluster and the other tranquil, but never callous or aloof. He knew some of the people had thought of them as their own children, since the two were orphans. People took a special interest in orphans, secretly gave them a little extra in terms of affection, though they had none to spare. The women, especially, cared for Samuel and Isaiah more than they should have, Maggie being the worst one and the one who should have known better. "Shit," a man called Coot whispered to Amos. "Excuse my tongue, but a tiny bit of nice between us ain't killed nobody yet." "They don't bother nobody around here," Naomi said quietly. "Some of us ain't got a lot of time no way. Might as well steal some kind of easy before the hard have its way with you." But the majority of those who Amos invited in remained silent, turned to one another with a look that Amos had only seen on the faces of Tubal. It jumped from one face to the next, like lanterns being lit in quick succession. Instead of too much resistance, Amos found a frightening commonality between Tubal and his own people that could be exploited quite easily. The idea that they could be better, more entitled to favor than others, have a kind of belly breeze of their own, hadn't really occurred to them. Occasionally, Paul would show more approval towards some of them based on the speed and dexterity with which they pulled cotton. But the reward for that was more work and greater expectation, not less. Sometimes he was a bit more lenient with the people whose color was diminished by Paul's interference, but the cost of that was evident. Now, because of Amos, they had this new concept to reckon with. They could have access to some kind of sometime just by virtue of not being one of the excluded. They had come to Amos 2 by 2, but they were seduced 1 by 1. People began avoiding Samuel and Isaiah. They would deliberately walk the long path, past the overseers and through the weeds, to dodge them on the common path to and from the field. They left tools on the ground outside the barn instead of handing them over directly. They bathed further up the shore away from them. They left no room for them at fire circles. They cut their eyes and screwed their faces each time Isaiah and Samuel dared displays that remotely resembled affection. Amos was there, down by the river, when Big Hosea attacked Samuel. Hosea had said that Samuel looked at him funny. Hosea was one of the few on the plantation who was sure he could take Samuel on. He always sought Samuel out to play wrestle in the high weeds as a means to test his own strength. So it took nothing for him to punch Samuel square in the jaw right there at the river in front of everyone. For his trouble, Samuel nearly split Big Hosea's head open against protruding rocks. Amos and others helped Hosea up as Isaiah held Samuel back. Hosea said Samuel looked at him in a way that made him feel defenseless, naked. Never mind that they were all naked from bathing. That look, he said, made him lunge for Samuel. Hosea's chest was heaving. Amos told him to calm down, told him that no one blamed him for doing what came natural for men to do. No one mentioned either that between Big Hosea's legs, his flesh was stiff and throbbing. Now it was Sunday. Amos was alone as he walked through the weeds, along the cotton field, and into the clearing beyond it. Just before he entered, he could see how the light fell down in that space and made things a pale gold. but the silence too gave things a color. He didn't have the language to describe it. It wasn't like it was blue, though that is what he would have said if he were less observant. He would have to be content with not having an answer for everything. Humble yourself, Amos. Be humble. Once in the embrace of the clearing, he sat on the rock, crossed his legs at the ankles, brought his hands together, and started to pray. When he was done, he opened his eyes wide, for he had heard the whisper. He brought his hand to his mouth. There was a faint frown on his lips. No, he thought, but the whispering voice was quietly, yes. The first of his congregation broke through the trees and into the clearing. Amos straightened up. It was Beanti, and she was holding Solomon, who was whining just a little. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, he said. Amos looked down at Solomon. His mouth tried to smile, but his eyes didn't. Hush. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the long road to the prophets is what I want to talk to you about today. I'm not sure how many of you have seen any of the virtual discussions I have had, but the prophets took me 14 years to write. And there is a reason why it took me 14 years, but I have to go back to a very early time in my life to describe that 14 years. So when I was 4 years old, my father bought me a Wonder Woman comic book. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted by the fact that there was this island filled with women who wanted to change the world. They wanted to make the world better for everyone. And they sent their emissary, Princess Diana, Wonder Woman, into the world to help make it a better place. And she had a tiara that she could use as a boomerang and bracelets that could deflect bullets and a magic lasso that could force people ensnared in it to tell the truth. And that sort of just ignited my imagination. And as soon as I could learn how to write, and I was about 6 years old, the first thing I did was write a story about Wonder Woman in which I was her sidekick, Wonder Boy. And it was the most amazing thing. I made myself the only boy allowed on Paradise Island, and it was just fantastic. And to fast forward a little bit, my friend Phil Jimenez was a writer and artist on Wonder Woman and actually drew me into a story as Wonder Boy some years later. So that was a full circle moment for me. And I knew then, although I did not have the words to articulate, that writing was powerful. And when I look back at it now, at that 6-year-old boy writing this story, I realized what I was doing. I was writing myself into some place that I did not initially see myself. And that would become a golden thread or a big theme in my writing. So years passed and I'm still writing, but I'm not taking it quite seriously because I come from a blue collar family where the goal is to get a really good job where you have really good benefits and you can retire from it and you have a really good pension. The idea of being an artist or being a writer was inconceivable. Maybe nice as a hobby, something that you do on the side, but it could not be your purpose. And so whenever I would get messages from the universe that writing is something that I should be doing, I would ignore it because I was being told by everyone who loved me that that was not something that I should pursue. So I would write on the side and I would work retail and all of these other jobs. Then once when I was 16, I went to a bookstore, an independent bookstore in Harlem, and they sold books primarily by African-American authors. And I came across a book by an author by the name of Terry McMillan. It was her first book called Mama. And I don't know, something about the cover made me pick up the book, and I bought it and I took it home and I read it. And it was the very first time that I had ever read a book that focused on the lives of Black people in a way that was ordinary, not attached to some sort of pathology like drug dealing or criminality. It was just ordinary Black family trying to survive, wanting to be educated, wanting better for themselves and their children. And I thought, oh, so it doesn't have to be Moby Dick. It doesn't have to be some grand novel, and it could be about people that look like me, that remind me of my own mother and father, my own grandparents. And so I tried then to write my very first novel at the age of 16. It was called Conjure, and I did succeed. I was typing it on an old-fashioned typewriter using colored construction paper. I'm not really sure why I did that. But I did not finish it. And I realize now the reason that I didn't finish it is because I was scared. I was writing a story about two teen boys who were in love. And I was terrified that my mother or my grandfather or somebody in my family would find this, and then they would accuse me of being gay. So I stopped and I hid it. But what I did do is I began to write really bad poetry. And I thought for many years that, oh, well, maybe I could be a poet. I'll work in retail, but then I can do poetry because that seems to be easier. So I started working at Toys R Us when I was 17 years old. I was what they called a ticket writer. And what a ticket writer did was the ticket writer was responsible for all the big ticket items. So like bikes and baby strollers and cribs and things like that. You would write a ticket, you give it to the customer to go purchase, and they would have to go outside and around to customer pickup to pick up their large item. And I actually liked working at Toys R Us, and it gave me a lot of time to write. And so that was really, really great. But I felt a kind of emptiness because I was seduced by the fact that I was earning money. And back then, minimum wage was $3.35 an hour. I was seduced by the idea that I was earning money, but I also felt a tremendous guilt because I was not following what I thought, what I was afraid was my purpose, which is writing. So I'm stumbling through life at this point. As a young man, I had to unfortunately drop out of high school because I was being bullied relentlessly by the other kids, and also in some cases by faculty, when they were noticing that I was not like other boys, that I was a bit more feminine, that I was more interested in girly things than I could not play sports. I was awkward. I would jump double dutch with the girls and I would play with dolls and things like that. And so that was not tolerated. And so I dropped out of school, and I immediately after what I should have graduated in June of that year, but I wound up taking the GED in December of that year and passed it with flying colors. I think the passing grade was something like 225, and I got like a 330, which I think might have been the highest score you could get on the test. So it was clear to the administrators that I had some intelligence, but that there was something else going on. But in the late 80s, there was not room to discuss that sort of issue that children was dealing with. I was expected to simply grow out of what was my inherent queerness. To fast forward a little bit more, I enrolled in college in 1992 at the age of 21, thinking that I was going to be a psychology major. And I took my first psychology course and I got a C. And I said, okay, maybe I'm not going to be a psychologist. But in my English courses, I got an A and A plus. And I still did not believe that I would be a writer. After that semester, I got into a relationship, which was semi-abusive, now that I think about it, at least emotionally so. And that made it very difficult for me to stay in school. So I left school again and worked full-time at Toys R Us, still feeling unfulfilled. And this happened for quite a number of years until I was maybe 27 or 28, and I re-enrolled in school again, this time saying I'll be a history teacher because I seem to really enjoy history. And again, that did not work out. And I wound up moving to Charlotte, North Carolina for a brief period of time to work for Bank of America in their human resource department, which was probably the best job I ever held. They were incredibly kind people. Charlotte is an incredibly beautiful city. I had to grow accustomed, even though I am a child of the South. My grandparents are on my father's side from Savannah, Georgia, and on my mother's side from Dillon, South Carolina. Moving back into the South after having lived in New York City for a really long time, I was almost frightened by the hospitality. People waving at you when you're driving past on they're sitting on their porches waving, and I'm like, who is that? And I had to grow accustomed to that. And I really fell in love with the city because of that. And it reminded me again of my childhood spending summers in the South. But then I sort of self-sabotaged. I was working at Bank of America, making really good money, getting promoted. I got promoted 3 times in 2 years, but then wound up getting fired because I did something that I knew I should not have done. And still to this day, couldn't figure out why I did it. But the reason now I know why I did it is because I was forcing myself to finally figure out and walk in my purpose. So I'm sitting at home, wondering what my next step is going to be, and panic takes over. And I'm thinking, okay, I have to get another job. And I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to do that, given that I just got fired from this job. And I'm watching Oprah. And Oprah has this guest on her show. And the gentleman says, you know what your purpose is. You have been avoiding it your entire life. And the reason why you're so afraid to pursue it is because you're thinking about the end goal. Don't think about the end goal. Think of the next tiny step you have to take to move in the direction of your purpose. Said, okay. So I'm down at the unemployment office, and there's this big chart as you're waiting online to speak to one of the clerks. And it says, on one end, it says, if you want to be and it has a list of professions, then you have to, and it tells you on the right-hand side what you have to do in order to pursue that profession. So I'm going down the lists and I'm looking for writer, and there it is near the bottom, writer. And I move over to the right column to see what does it say? Go to college. So I said, okay, at the age of 31, I am going to go back to college. So I called up my mother and I said, Ma, I'm going to move back to Brooklyn because I want to go back to school to pursue my degree in writing. She says, your room is still here. So I packed up all my stuff and I came back to Brooklyn, and I enrolled as an English major, creative writing. And how I knew that that was finally the right thing that I was supposed to do is that I got nothing but A's the entire time I was an English major, like in every class, even when I had to take like geology and chemistry, I was getting A's because I felt so energized by the fact that I was here following my purpose. And even though I felt a bit of shame because I was much older than some of the other freshmen, I kind of look back on that and think it was probably the best time for me to go to college, because when I first enrolled, I didn't know why I was there. So I was wasting my time and money. But when I went back at 31, I knew exactly why I was there and got the most out of it. And so I'm in my final semester of undergrad, and I was also an Africana Studies minor. And I was reading all of these wonderful works in the canon by such luminary authors such as Zora Neale Hurston and W.E.B. Du Bois and Wallace Thurman and my spiritual godfather, James Baldwin. And something struck me as rather odd. What was odd to me is that Black queer people are not mentioned until the Harlem Renaissance, so the 1920s. Wallace Thurman is writing The Blacker the Berry in 1929, and that is the first reference I ever see of Black queer people. And I thought, and I would ask some of my professors, well, where were Black queer people before the Harlem Renaissance? And the answer I got from some of the sociologists was interesting to me. They said, well, there was no homosexual identity, so they were nowhere. And I thought, so you need to tell me, I'm saying to myself, as a 2-year-old who would run into the kitchen and pick up the tops of pots to pretend that they were tambourines so that I could be Valerie and the Josie and the Pussycats, did not have the word homosexual, but he knew that there was something different about him. And because I knew that intrinsically I was different from other boys, that answer from the sociologist did not sit well with me. And I thought, you don't have to have an identity or a name for an identity to know who you are, to know what you like, to know what you love, what you're attracted to. So I wanted to do a little bit more digging. And so I did. And I reread a slave narrative entitled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. And in 2 sentences in that book, Mrs. Jacobs describes an act in which a slave master rapes a male slave. And so then we have in Toni Morrison's Beloved, a scene where her character, Paul D, is sexually assaulted by a male overseer. And I thought to myself, okay, yes, this sounds like this could have possibly happened, that these things ring true, but I have a question. What about love? And because Toni Morrison herself said, if you cannot find the book you wish to read, then you must write it, I had to go about the terrifying work of writing it. And why it was terrifying for me was because the antebellum slavery period, which is the period I chose to set the novel in, is sacrosanct for many, many people in African-American communities. So much so that it is almost a spiritual, religious experience, and introducing something like queerness seems sacrilegious. And I knew I would get a lot of criticism because there are some people in the community who believe that all of pre-colonial Africa was heterosexual, and that the only reason why a Black person is queer in the modern age is because of the atrocities that happened during slavery. Something in my spirit told me that that was false, that something as intrinsic as queerness was just a normal part of the human experience. But I needed verification, not just for myself, but for potential readers of what I was attempting to create. And I found that confirmation in when I went to listen to the oral histories of Indigenous Africans. One in particular, Esther Arma from Ghana, talks about how sometimes things get lost in the translation. A couple of people who interviewed her great-grandparents who were Westerners, they asked about homosexuality in these communities in Ghana, and her great-grandparents said, we don't have this homosexual, we don't know what you mean, we don't have this. And those Westerners went away believing, oh, there is no homosexuality in this tribe. And what Esther revealed was, had they explained to her great-grandparents what homosexual meant, they would have said, oh, you mean love, you mean sex. They just did not have particular words to separate different kinds of loving or sexual arrangements. They considered them all part of the natural landscape. And so that was the key for me in understanding that homosexuality, queerness, lesbianism, transgenderness was something that was normal and natural to indigenous Africans, to the world. And it was only through Western projects like colonialism and capitalism, and in many cases, Christianity, that indigenous Africans began to see these behaviors as sinful or criminal. And that gave me the courage to then go ahead and write this book. My first semester of the MFA program, Stacy D'Erasmo, a novelist, was my fiction tutorial instructor. And she gave us an assignment. She said, I want you to go out into the world and find objects that a character you're thinking about might own or possess. And I thought to myself, well, that's going to be difficult because I don't know what someone in the mid-19th century would own that I could find in the 21st century. And maybe 2 days or 3 days after that class, I'm walking down one of the main thoroughfares of Brooklyn, Flatbush Avenue. And there is a big pile of black garbage bags and garbage cans out on the sidewalk. Some business put their garbage out for sanitation to pick up in the morning. And out of one of the metal garbage cans is hanging this chain. And I walked over to it and I looked and I pulled it. And at the end of it was a shackle. And I said, shackles in Brooklyn? And I just thought, this is weird. And then I went, aha, this is this character giving me permission to write this story. This is the shackle that the character that eventually became known as Isaiah was being held with. And this is my confirmation that Isaiah, wherever Isaiah is in the universe, is saying, please be a witness to my testimony. So I went about witnessing his testimony. And the first time that I attempted to write the prophets, it was only going to be from Isaiah's point of view. And his name at the time was Hannibal, and the book was going to be called Sing Hannibal, Bear Witness, and I was going to write it in the vein of a slave narrative. But then I realized that Isaiah's point of view was too narrow for the project I was attempting. I wanted something with more breadth, a wider scope. And so I said, well, maybe if Hannibal and his lover, Simon, who eventually becomes Samuel, if they were writing almost as though they were writing letters to each other over a distance, maybe I can get a better sense of their lives. And even then, the scope seemed too small. Then I said, okay, what is at the center of this? What is it that I'm trying to convey? And I had to go back to that question, what about love? And that is when I said, the center of this novel must be their love, and what that love requires is witnesses. And that is when the chorus of other voices began to come in, Haggai, who becomes Maggie, and many others. And the novel's name changed from Sing Hannibal, Bear Witness to the Book of Samuel at one point, and then Plantation Lullabies at another point, until I finally settled on the prophets when I actually heard what I thought was the voices of the prophets. In the midst of writing this novel, I had a dream that I was in a field that was gated, and I was digging in the ground with a very old man who seemed to be like my great-great-grandfather or something like that. And he was telling me that I was, whatever it was that we were doing in the ground, and I think we were tilling it to plant seed or something like that. He said, "You're doing it wrong." And then he stood up and he put his arms on his waist and he said, "You do not yet know us." And I keep on the side of my bed a notepad and a pen. So I wake up out of this dream and I said, let me write it down because I'm never going to remember this. And I scribbled in the dark, "You do not yet know us." And I went back to bed, woke up the next morning and went into my computer to work on the manuscript some, and looked at the notepad and said, "You do not yet know us." And I was like, oh, this is the ancestors telling me they want a part of this, that they want to be able to tell their piece of the story as well. And as I was writing from that voice, that chorus of voices, it became clear to me that they were almost as though they were speaking, or they were prophesying. And I thought, I like the way they're talking to me, almost chastising me in some ways, and therefore chastising the reader. And I want to incorporate that in there. And I want it to be such that every character in this book is revealing in some way the way a prophet would be. And that is how I came up with the name, The Prophets. And so I had spent 14 years writing and rewriting this book because I needed to get it right. I needed to make sure that it was unassailable in terms of the criticisms that I thought I would receive from those who would question the integrity of the work, but also my intentions in reinscribing into the cultural narrative the Black queer figures that I believe have been erased. Those voices that I heard, the ancestral voices that run through the prophets, also led me back to an earlier time in which there's a pre-colonial African society, fictional, the Kasongo people, but based on many of the tribes I encountered in my research who had different understandings of sexuality and gender identity. I hear from a lot of readers that when they first encounter that society and they meet King Akusa, they assume right off the bat that King Akusa is male, but King Akusa is actually female. And what I learned in my studies of these pre-colonial African societies is that for them, king was simply a title, for some of them anyway. And that whomever held the leadership role was king, whether they were male, female, or non-binary, or what have you. And that was another enlightening moment for me. And it helped me to sort of show how Western thought and this indigenous thought kind of diverge, and the ways in which Western thought sort of takes over and asserts itself in a central position that it hasn't really earned. And I wanted to show that sort of dichotomy in the prophets. And so here I am, done with the first draft. And this is after I had already graduated from the MFA program. And I needed a reader. And who better to read it than my husband, Adrian, who is a Virgo and an attorney, so that I knew the criticism would be A1. So he was the very first reader. And as I imagined, he ripped it to shreds, which is what you actually want as a writer. You want a writer, a critic, to really tell you all of the things that work and all of the things that do not work, so that you could really present your best work. Because the sort of agony of being a writer is that you're always a better writer than you were. You're always a better writer today than you were yesterday, but you're never as good a writer today as you will be tomorrow. And so you're always caught in that liminal space. So Adrian read it, gave me his feedback, and I spent years rewriting based on his criticism. And then I wanted to give it to someone who actually taught English. I gave it to a good friend of mine, Osvaldo Oyola, who was adjuncting at NYU. And I said, Osvaldo, please read this and tell me if I have a shot in hell getting this published, if this is worthy, if this subject matter is worth it. Don't hold back, be unsparing, but give me everything you got. And he went away for a couple of months and he came back and he said, Robert, this might be one of the most extraordinary things I've ever read. There's problems in it. You have some flaws that you must work out and you must fix because you're almost there, but please keep writing. So I kept writing. And then I was sort of at a loss after that because I didn't know exactly how to jump from, I have a great idea here, to how do I get this published? So I reached out to some of my friends who I knew were published. And my friend Kiese Lehman, who wrote the memoir Heavy, said to me, I have to show this to my agent. His agent was PJ Mark of Janko and Nesbitt. And I had been interviewing with agents to determine who I would go with as representing me. And none of the others worked out, but when PJ and I talked, we instantly clicked and he absolutely got it. And the reason why I bring up the meeting with PJ is because what a lot of writers don't know is that having a literary agent is probably the most crucial piece to being published, because the literary agent who is savvy will move you out of the way of all the pitfalls and obstacles, will be your number one advocate, will not let you get taken advantage of, and will ensure that if you have something that is worthy, he will work with you on it, or she will work with you on it, or they will work with you on it. And they will make sure that it gets into the right hands at the right publisher so that you're not full of regret later on. So PJ and I then worked on the manuscript for about a year. And then he said, okay, Robert, this is as far as we can take it. We're going to shop it. And he warned me of rejections and things of that nature. And I had heard the author Marlon James say that his first novel received 69 rejections. And so I had prepared myself. I said, okay, I'm going to get, if he got 69 and he's such a brilliant writer, I'm sure I'm going to get 169. I'll just have to keep going after that. And so that is not what happened. What happened was PJ called me up on my father's birthday, rest his soul, and said, and maybe my father had something to do with this. And he said, Robert, there are 7 publishers who want to publish your book. And I said, but PJ, you told me that I was going to get rejections. And he said, yeah, but this is what happened. And I said, okay, so what next? How do we choose? And he goes, well, you're going to meet with all 7 publishers over the next 7 days. And so it's going to be a whirlwind, and they're going to bid on it. It's going to go to something called auction. And that word made me feel a little off because I'm like, the subject matter, auction, okay. But it was not exactly the same. So I met with all of the publishers, and some of the publishers were really, the editors that I met were really, really nice. Peter Blackstock of Grove and Sarah McGrath of Riverhead, just some really wonderful, wonderful people. But I'm of a superstitious lot. And I have a vision board at home that has all of these things that I hope to accomplish one day. The awards I wish to win, the home that I wish to live in, all of those sorts of things. When I'd like to retire, where I'd like to retire. And one of the things I have is a house that's in my favorite part of Brooklyn. It's called Ditmas Park, which your town reminds me of. I think that's probably why I'm already in love with it. It's just beautiful colonial houses, and it's trees everywhere, and it's just quiet and lovely. And I have this house right on my vision board. And so I'm meeting with the editors, and I happen to meet with Sally Kim from Putnam, who is now my editor. So obviously I chose Putnam. And Sally and I sit down, and there's just some magic when we're speaking, the way she understood what I was trying to do with the work, why I was doing it. And we just had such a wonderful rapport. And I went home and I'm meditating and I'm thinking, ancestors, please guide me, because I have to make these choices. And I should say that I actually did not go with the highest bidder when the bids all came in, and the highest bidder bid super high. And I had never been offered that much money in my entire life. And I never thought I would be offered that much money and turn it down. But I did, because that partnership did not feel right in my gut. And as my grandmother used to tell me when I was young, your gut is your God. And so I trusted it. So once I decided not to go with the highest bidder, I had to go now with the next highest bidder. And that happened to be 3 different publishers who all bid at the same amount. So I had to meet with all 3 of them again, Viking, Riverhead, and Putnam. And I had to meditate, because all 3 of them were wonderful editors and wonderful publishers. But what came to me in my meditation was that house on my vision board. And then it dawned on me, Sally Kim lives in Ditmas Park. The answer was in front of me all along. It's going to be Sally Kim. And so because of our wonderful rapport and because of that guidance from my ancestors, I chose Putnam and Sally Kim. And Sally and I then worked on The Prophets for about another 6 months to maybe 9 months to make sure that we got it to as good as we could possibly get it. And we were really working on it down to the wire, like right before it was going to go to print. I kept emailing her saying, oh, wait, could I just change this one thing? Could I add this one person to the list of acknowledgements, which you can see? My acknowledgements is 10 pages long, which is highly unconventional. My husband, who was doing all the research about the publishing industry, said, no, your acknowledgement page cannot be more than 2 pages long. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to fit these hundreds and hundreds of names in 2 pages. I'm just going to do the 10 pages and see what happens. And as you can see, the acknowledgements thanks people like Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, who had a tremendous influence on me literarily, and even people like Janet Jackson. Fun fact is I know every step to every Janet Jackson video, all the choreography. That's how obsessed I am with Janet Jackson. And we worked on it, worked very, very hard on it. But you never know how it's going to be received in the world. And I was driving myself insane, thinking about criticism and critique from the majors like the New Yorker, the New York Times, and all of these places, and realized that none of that really matters when I got an instant message from a young Black queer man. I think he was 17 years old. And he said to me after he read The Prophets, Mr. Jones, thank you for writing this book. It saved my life. Then I realized all of the other things are kind of gravy or frosting, but that is the reason for writing this book, so that some person, Black or not, queer or not, male or female or not, could read this and glean some sort of value from it that makes their lives better or inspires them to make the lives of other people better. That is the only reason for me to write, to make some change in the world for the better. We are in some very strange times. So much of writing this book was deja vu for me, in the sense that it's been so many years since the end of the antebellum period, and yet so much has not changed. I think about Texas and the right for women and other people with wombs to have autonomy over their own bodies, and that's still up for debate. I can't imagine that in 2021 we're still dealing with things that we were dealing with in 1821 and 1721. It is beyond the pale, and so I write this book with the hopes that it moves people to move us in a better place, lest we face annihilation unnecessarily. If we, Maya Angelou she said in her inaugural poem for the Clinton administration, toward the end of it, she goes, when you can look into your brother's eye, your mother's eye, your sister's eye, and say, good morning. And that line is so simple, but it's also so deep and so real, because what she was saying was to be able to see one another as valuable, as knowing that I'm not separate from you. We are all of the same cosmic stuff. And what I do to you, I do to myself. I can't diminish you without diminishing myself. We are all literally connected to not just one another, but to the air, to the animals, to the grass, to the trees. And I don't understand how we cannot know that and how we could not treat each other with the utmost compassion and care. And hopefully, my job as the writer is to wake us up to that inarguable fact that all of us are connected. James Baldwin said it. He said it in a much more sexist way, because that was the parlance of the time. But he said all men are brothers, and that's not being metaphorical or poetic. We are all connected, and the prophets is my attempt to ensure that we know that, because now we can no longer say we don't know, and so that we become accountable and responsible for our actions toward one another. And so I hope that when you read the prophets, you get to see that the characters, all of them, whether they're protagonists or antagonists, I return to my grandmother. She used to say, all good people have a little bit of evil in them, and all evil people have a little bit of good in them. And that is the truth about us. And that's what I try to convey in the prophets, that even the most dastardly, the Amoses and the Pauls, there is a reason for the way they behave, and they weren't always that way. And maybe if we could look at each other, even when we're at our lowest and behaving in the most cruel ways, if we could still remember that is a human being, that is a person, maybe we can convince each other to act more humanely. I'm not 100% sure that always works, but I hope that we can move in a direction in which that's more possible, and not less possible. And the ending of this book, the acknowledgement section, many people tell me that they see it as the actual final chapter of the book. And I want to believe that that is the case, because I stand here before you as one, but as I think maybe it was Maya Angelou who said, but I move toward you as 10,000. All of those people, from my fourth grade teacher, Howard Firestone, who was the first person that told me that I was a good writer, to all of the other people, my grandfather and my grandmother, and so many others. I could not have written this book without their love, their energy, their encouragement, their support. And so that is probably the best way to have ended this novel, because that is the intention of the novel, is to reveal, yes, so that we understand what truth is, the ugly truth of our country, so that we could heal the wound instead of trying to cover it up and letting it fester. So please understand and take away from this book what the project is for me is compassion and love. And I wish that for all of you, compassion, love, and healing. Thank you. If anyone has any questions or comments or anything, I am very open to answering any questions whatsoever.
Do we have to wait 14 more years?
For the next book?
That's what I'm asking.
No. I have already begun the research for my second novel. I will always be writing from the Black queer perspective, so it will likely deal with characters who live at that intersection. I just started the research. I have actually written some stuff. I have about 40 pages of stuff that I don't know if is going to make it, but that's, as a writer, you have to get it out just to get you, find your bearings. And so I'm thinking maximum 5 years, but I don't think more than that. 3 to 5 years. I am one of those writers that I wish I could just turn it out like that, but I can't, because I always think so deeply about everything that I write, and I want to make sure that I'm not being offensive in the bad way, as opposed to offensive in the way that is a calling to wake people up. So maybe 3 to 5 years. If I could just get some quiet time, which just this town is so quiet. So maybe I can find some place up here to write, because back in Brooklyn, I can't find the quiet. And most of The Prophets was written at 3 o'clock in the morning, because that's the magic hour, the witching hour, and also the only time in Brooklyn where things are just quiet, where you actually can hear the voices. So 3 to 5 years, perhaps. You're welcome.
Thank you. Do you think you'll continue writing historical fiction?
That is a great question. I feel like Toni Morrison in that sense, that she said, there are things, we're so quick to move ahead, but there's things we have to remember. And so I like to remember things. There are things that I think need to be excavated, that we have buried. So I think in some sense, I will probably always write historically, although I do have an idea for something that's kind of, I don't want to say science fiction, kind of speculative fiction that takes place a little bit in the future, but I still have to think about that one. I'm actually more comfortable writing in the past. The next novel, I think, is going to be set in the late 80s, early 90s. At least that's where my heart is pulling me. So I think I'm most comfortable writing historical fiction. Yes. But maybe not always. Who knows?
How did you research the manner of speech, the language that your characters used?
That is such a wonderful question. I drew on a lot of my own family's history. I spent a great deal of my summers as a child on an actual plantation, and I didn't even realize it was a plantation. My great aunt Annie, so my grandmother's aunt Annie, built her home with her husband. I can't remember his name. He died before I was born. On this tract of land in which her grandmother was enslaved on. And at some point, the owner of the plantation, once the enslaved people were freed, gave them tracts of land. And her grandmother passed it down to her mother. Her mother's name, my great aunt Annie's mother's name was Binky, Binky Bethay. And and that is her birth name. Like we like looked for all the records. Her name is Binky. I was like, that's an interesting name. And she passed it down to her daughter, Annie. And Annie built her home with her bare hands. Her husband and her built their home. And I used to spend my summers there. And I remembered all of their speech patterns, all of the expressions they used, all of that sort of thing. And it came back to me as I was writing this novel. And it felt so authentic. And so I asked my African-American music professor, Salim Washington, if I could hear, because he had these audio of newly freed enslaved people who were being interviewed for posterity. And I was listening to them speak, and all of those same words, they were using them. And so I knew that I was on the right track. So that's how I got the voices and the speech patterns and such.
So there's a question from the chat. So I'm going to turn my back to you and read it, but it's from Doug from Provincetown. So I'm happy to announce the festival has now gone national. So that is a good milestone. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to read that to you. And apparently he was at a talk just a couple of weeks ago. So he's checking back in with you.
Okay.
I asked the question just asked to Robert 2 weeks ago, and it sounds like he's made progress on number 2 during those 2 weeks. I would love to suggest that those characters in pre-colonial Africa need to be brought forth. Those characters that loved before the Europeans changed things. What would Robert have a reaction to that?
You know, the parts of the prophets that I enjoyed writing most were those parts that go back to pre-colonial Africa. And I feel like King Akusa's story is not over. So it is very possible that I might write about her at some point if I have the courage and the wherewithal to do so. Because I was very, very enamored by those parts of the novel, the parts that for me almost were not me. It almost felt like I was channeling something, because there are some times when I read for events like this, when I'm reading a section of the novel and I close the book and I go, I don't remember writing that. And so perhaps I might return to the Kasango people to excavate some more.
You mentioned that you were concerned about the well, I'm curious, what has been the
You know, surprisingly, I have only received positive feedback from people saying, thank you for writing it in a way in which slavery is not the character, that slavery is the backdrop, but these characters all have full, round, developed dimensional lives. I have not heard any direct criticism about having placed queerness in this time period. I have received a little bit of criticism about the critiques of Christianity from some people, and I knew that was coming. I come from a family that on my mother's side is African Methodist Episcopalian and Southern Baptist, and on my father's side, I got that flipped. On my mother's side, Nation of Islam, which is, you know, really strict, and on my father's side, African Methodist Episcopalian and Southern Baptist. And so I knew what to expect, and all of the criticism has been very Christian in that it's quite kind, but it is also pointed. But that is kind of like, I didn't expect that, you know, everyone would receive this openly. Part of putting a work like this out in the world is to have that dialogue that might sometimes get heated. As long as we remember each other's humanity when we're engaging, I'm okay.
We have another question from the internet. It is, can you talk about your reading practices? Who do you love to read?
I have, there are so many authors that I love to read. Of course, Baldwin, of course, Morrison. I love, oddly enough, one of my favorite books is Washington Square by Henry James. I absolutely adore that book. It's like, I was the only one in the MFA class that liked it. Like we were assigned it for reading and I was just like, oh my God, I love this book. I just loved it. I love Herman Melville, Equiano. He had a short story about an enslaved, a slave ship. And he wrote in that time with such clarity about race. He was so clear on what whiteness, how whiteness can have a deleterious effect, not just on Black people, but also on white people. It diminishes one's own humanity. He was just brilliant. Gloria Naylor, Octavia Butler, Zora Neale Hurston, Wallace Thurman, gosh, so many people. I could like name a zillion authors who I just think are absolutely stunning. One of the things I realized about writing is that it's not really this mystical art. There are so many great writers that I encounter who don't believe in themselves enough to believe that they could write, and so they don't. And then they die and you find their manuscripts and then it gets published and you're thinking, wow, this person was brilliant and never knew it. So that's very sad, but those are just some of the dozens and dozens of authors that I find brilliant and inspiring.
One more question? All right, well, thank you, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So we are selling books right around the corner here, and then Robert will be signing up in the front lobby. So we just want to ask you to please space yourselves accordingly. Thank you.